Hello there, everybody. This is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, coming at you for another of our live videos here on the National Museum of Civil War Medicine Facebook page, or if you're watching this later after we post it, on YouTube. Welcome. Today we are going to be discussing medical care at the Battle of Fredericksburg in 1862, which is appropriate as today, December 11th, is the 158th anniversary of the beginning of that particular battle in Virginia. So for those of you who are just tuning in, I see we already have some folks saying hello in the comments section. Feel free to jump into the comments at any time. We like to have an awesome conversation going on there that kind of allows folks to get to know one another. If you have questions as we're going through today's presentation, that's a great place to ask. As I'm the only one here today and giving this presentation, I won't be able to see the comments in real time, but drop those into the comments section throughout the presentation, and we will come around to those in the end. We've been doing these videos here since March on the Facebook page and on YouTube. Very much believe in the new digital initiative at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. A little bit about our organization. We are located in Frederick, Maryland. We have 2 additional locations, the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum in Washington, D.C., and the Pry House Field Hospital Museum on Antietam National Battlefield. I am stationed at the Missing Soldiers Office in DC typically, but I am streaming live from my apartment in Washington today. And thank you all so much for tuning in with us today. If you do enjoy these videos, please consider becoming a supporter of the museum here on Facebook. I have a newfangled button that I can press here. So if you want to get updates about the museum when we go live and when we're posting videos, please go ahead and follow our page. There should be a button there for you right now to prompt you to become a follower of the museum. That will give you, again, updates about when the museum is going live and how you can go ahead and support us that way. You can like this video, that helps us. Share the video, that also helps us get more people joining in. And another button, another technique, new thing I've learned through Facebook Live here is you can support us. We have a fundraising campaign going on right now. That is the Support Hope Through History campaign. We've already received almost $9,000 in just the last couple of weeks. You can support us by donating to that campaign. You can find that in the comments section, or I'm going to try this, another new button they gave me here. You can do so at the link, which I believe I am showing right now. So that's where you can go and donate. Every little bit helps us to continue doing this sort of live stream, these kinds of programs, to share that with all of you wherever you may be watching. We've had folks tuning into these videos from around the United States and across the world. So this is a tremendous opportunity to support us, allow us to continue doing these live streams and to improve on these live streams. So we've already, with some of the money from membership and donations, we've already purchased some new audio equipment, new sound equipment, new video equipment, and there's more coming in 2021. So if you support us, you can go to civilwarmed.org, our website, or you can go to the link in the comment section that will allow you to donate to this campaign and to provide some support for these videos. If you enjoy them, you like these videos, we do provide so much content for free. Please consider becoming either a member, a donor, or supporting this particular fundraiser campaign. All right, so with all of that being said, let's dive into today's presentation. Again, if I can't see the comments as we're going through the presentation today, so if you do have questions, feel free to drop those into the comment section, and I'll come around to those at the end. We'll dedicate some time to looking at your questions. Want to make this as to answer any burning questions you might have about the Battle of Fredericksburg and about Civil War medicine. So I'm going to go into share screen mode now. And we are going to talk today again about the medical care at the Battle of Fredericksburg. This is again the 158th anniversary of the battle's beginning on December 11th, 1862. So let's dive right in. So this battle takes place December 11th through December 15th, 1862. We're going to deal with 18,000 casualties as a result of this battle. And it doesn't rank among the deadliest battles of the Civil War particularly highly when we start to compare it to things like Gettysburg and Chickamauga and Antietam. It doesn't quite stack up, but what is notable about this particular battle is the conditions that the battle is going to be fought in. It is December, though it's not going to be as cold as it sometimes can be in wintertime during the Civil War. These armies are not used to fighting in many of these cold temperatures, and that's going to make the experience for the wounded soldier particularly bleak during this particular battle. It is lopsided. The casualty figures from this battle are extremely lopsided, and that is because this is a resounding Confederate victory, a defensive victory, one in which they're going to allow the Union Army to continuously attack them, and they're going to dish it out much greater than they're going to receive it in this particular battle. The Army of the Potomac, that's going to be the Union Army we're going to be discussing today. They suffer more than 12,500 casualties in this fight. And that is compared to the Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederate Army we're going to be discussing today. They only suffer 5,300 casualties. So it's a 2-to-1 heading towards a 3-to-1 difference in casualty figures in this battle. It is extremely lopsided, and we'll get into some of why that is in talking about the medical care of the battle. We actually have to talk a little bit about the battle itself as well. So in terms of wounded soldiers, which we're going to be talking mostly about today, Union Army, 10,000 wounded soldiers that are going to need treatment. Confederate Army, about 4,000 wounded soldiers that are going to need treatment. So these are the battle lines. Now this is a map from 1860, from the 1860s that shows kind of the layout of the battlefield at Fredericksburg. Now, if you have been to Fredericksburg and Spotsylvania National Military Park, I highly recommend it. I worked as an intern there back in 2015. That really kind of whet my appetite for this particular battle and the other engagements that they talk about. You can see much of the southern part of this battlefield is still in Park's hands and still looks somewhat like it did back in the 1860s. The northern part of the battlefield, the area immediately in and around the town and city of Fredericksburg, much of that has been developed today, but there are still some of the important sites are still recognizable today if you go and visit the battlefield. Now, this map here does show Union forces in blue, Confederate forces in red. I know that color doesn't quite pop out, the red one, or the red color. The reason I have this map here is because this is going to be, this map helps us understand kind of the geography and the topography we're going to be dealing with in this particular battle. Geography, topography, they are very important in influencing how battles actually take place during the Civil War, but they're also important to understanding the medical challenges facing the medical departments in the Union and Confederate armies. So we need to note two items on this particular map. One, the Union Army, Army of the Potomac, is going to be dealing with this line on the map here. This is going to be a thorn in their side at the beginning of the battle for the Army in general, and then for the medical department at the conclusion of the battle. This is the Rappahannock River. This plays a crucial role in this particular battle. And on the Confederate side, we have another thing we can note, another item we can note on this map that is crucial to their medical side of medical perspective of this battle. And that is going to be another line on this map right here, and that is the Richmond, Fredericksburg and Potomac Railroad. And this line here, you'll note, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, is going to be between the lines right here. In fact, the railroad is going to play a crucial role in this battle, and is going to, for the medical department of the Confederate Army, is going to play a role in how they evacuate patients from the battlefield. So these are the lines. These are the battle lines that we are going to be talking about today, the topography, geography that we're going to be talking about. We will talk a little bit about the battle itself, kind of how these armies come into contact, but we're going to try to take a mostly medical perspective of this particular battle. So we'll move on to our two main figures that we're going to be talking about today. This is the medical leadership of these two armies. On the left is Lafayette Guild. He is the surgeon and medical director of the Army of Northern Virginia. Fredericksburg is going to mark his return to active campaigning with that army. He was on the field at 2nd Manassas. For those of you who watched our 2nd Manassas live videos, you heard us talk a lot about Lafayette Guild. He does not participate actively in the Sharpsburg-Antietam campaign, but he returns to the Army of Northern Virginia for the Fredericksburg battle. He's a native of Alabama, graduated from Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia in 1848, and joined the U.S. Army as an assistant surgeon in 1849, before eventually resigning his commission and joining up with Confederate forces. On the right, someone very familiar to those of you who have watched our live streams in the past or heard me do programs for the museum. This is Jonathan Letterman. Major Letterman is the medical director of the Army of the Potomac. He is a native of Pennsylvania, an 1849 graduate of Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia. Yes, the same school as Lafayette Guild. He also joined the U.S. Army as an assistant surgeon in 1849. In fact, these two men actually have a lot in common, and their paths are going to come across numerous times during the Civil War. But both of them are going to have pretty tall tasks ahead of them in December of 1862 with the Fredericksburg campaign. Let's talk a little bit about what these individuals are facing and what they're thinking about, in the fall of 1862. So Jonathan Letterman, his focus in late 1862 is continuing his reform of the Army of the Potomac's medical department. He initiated changes in the summer of 1862 that saw the first use of an organized ambulance corps during the Civil War. His efforts proved somewhat successful in September of 1862 at the Battle of Antietam, but he identified key ways in which he needed to continue improving that department. Much of this revolved around medical supplies, ensuring that adequate supplies are on hand when needed in battle, and ultimately who controlled them. So in circulars that he published within the Army before the Fredericksburg campaign began in November, Letterman mandated that adequate medical supplies needed to be on hand with the Army at all times, especially when it comes to when these units are going into battle. This was a direct response to shortages that occurred at Antietam. He also dictated that the staffing at field hospitals, ensuring that the most efficient and competent surgeons were performing surgery, while also ensuring adequate record keeping to make sure that they could track how patients were being treated, and that ultimately leads to better patient outcomes. Fredericksburg, Letterman knew, would challenge his reformed department, but also provide an opportunity to continue making improvements. Using Antietam as a guide, Letterman and his medical officers understood that treating wounded close to the battlefield would mean better outcomes for patients. Because the Army of the Potomac sat across from Fredericksburg for several weeks before they actually launched their attack, Letterman brought forward staff and resources to establish hospitals near the battlefield that could provide long-term care for any casualties that may take place during the campaign. He set these hospitals up on the Union-controlled shore of the Rappahannock River, including here at the Lacey House, just across from Fredericksburg itself. These hospitals are meant to treat the wounded from a battle Letterman and all of the Union forces that are present on the northern side of the Rappahannock River, that they know that a battle in a campaign is actively coming. Referring to the Lacey House here, one of the people that is present on the eve of the battle, she gets there before the battle actually begins, is a figure that is probably well known to all of you and someone that I work closely with in regards to the Civil War, Clara Barton. She is among the medical staff, volunteer in her case, that is present at the Lacey House on the eve of the battle. The Angel of the Battlefield, she already has that nickname, has made her return to the Army of the Potomac after Antietam. She stood on the veranda, you can see it here, on the second floor, on December 10th, 1862, as Union forces prepared to launch attacks at dawn the next day. And she wrote a letter about this to her cousin Vera that is very poignant and kind of sets the stage for what this battle is going to be like. So this is in the Library of Congress collection. I'm going to read this for you here. I always love looking at the Civil War and the documents that these people are writing. These contemporary sources provide so much information and fascinating detail of what it was like to actually be there. So this is what she writes. This is what Clara Barton writes. My dear cousin Vera, 5 minutes time with you, and God only knows what those 5 minutes might be worth to the many doomed thousands sleeping around me. It is the night before battle. The enemy, Fredericksburg, and its mighty entrenchments lie before us, the river between. At tomorrow's dawn, our troops will essay to cross, and the guns of the enemy will sweep those frail bridges at every breath. The moon is shining through the soft haze with a brightness almost prophetic. For the last half hour, I have stood alone in the awful stillness of its glimmering light, gazing upon the strange, sad scene around me, striving to say, Thy will, O God, be done. The campfires blaze with unwonted brightness. The sentry's tread is still but quick. The acres of little shelter tents are dark and still as death. No wonder for us, as I gazed sorrowfully upon them, I thought I could almost hear the slow flap of the grim messenger's wings, as one by one he sought and selected his victims for the morning. Sleep, weary one, sleep, and rest for tomorrow toil. Oh, sleep and visit in dreams once more the loved ones nestling at home. They may yet live to dream of you, cold, lifeless, and bloody. But this dream, soldier, is thy last. Paint it brightly, dream it well. Oh, northern mothers, wives, and sisters, all unconscious of the hour, would to heaven that I could bear for you the concentrated woe which is soon to follow. Would that Christ would teach my soul a prayer that would plead to the Father for grace sufficient for you, God pity and strengthen you, every one. Mine are not the only waking hours. The light yet burns brightly in our kind-hearted general's tent, where he pens what may be a last farewell to his wife and children, and thinks sadly of his fated men. Already the roll of the moving artillery is sounded in my ears, and the battle draws near, and I must catch 1 hour's sleep for tomorrow's labor. Good night, dear cousin, and heaven grant you strength for your more peaceful and less terrible, but not less weary days than mine. Yours in love, Clara. Battle would indeed come the next morning. Barton provided nursing care in and around Fredericksburg during the battle and throughout the weeks that followed. So let's take a look here, flip over to the opposite shore, to the southern shore of the Rappahannock River, talk a little bit about what the Confederate challenges are on the eve of this battle. Lafayette Guild and his small Confederate medical team with Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia understood that Union forces were poised for attack. They had been sitting there since November of 1862. By now, we're at mid-December of that year. We're waiting a Union attack. They did not, however, make a lot of the extensive preparations for a medical response on the soon-to-be battlefield that their Union counterparts made. Their plans involved the immediate treatment of Confederate wounded at makeshift field hospitals before sending off the wounded to Richmond's many military hospitals using the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. This is going to have a snag, though. As the battle develops, the railroad itself is going to become part of the battlefield, as I've already mentioned. This particular sketch shows we can see a train on the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad heading towards the south and east out of Fredericksburg. This stretch of the rail line is going to get caught between the lines, which we can see in our next map, which is a little bit of a closer version of the previous map that I showed, where we can see, again, the line cutting across this map is the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. It connected Fredericksburg with the Confederate capital. And had been completed decades before the Civil War. It was a single track for almost its entire length. This was going to prove very problematic in the winter of 1862-63 for the Confederate Army at Fredericksburg. The railroad just southeast of Fredericksburg proved incredibly vulnerable, meaning that wounded that Guild intended to ship to Richmond had to be taken directly from behind the lines by ambulances several miles south before they could be safely placed aboard trains. That slowed the evacuation of the wounded, required more ambulances than Guild had on hand. So Guild's going to call on a private ambulance organization from Richmond to assist him in transporting the wounded. If you'll note, you can see the railroad is going to cut right through the battlefield. It's going to cross just to the north side of these heights before heading south and west towards Richmond. So several miles south, the railroad is going to be accessible to Confederate forces, and they're going to use it to begin transporting their wounded. This is going to be Guild's biggest challenge for the Confederate medical department over the course of this battle, in order to transport his wounded quickly off to the military hospitals at Richmond. Into the battle itself begins on the morning of December 11th, 1862. Union forces trying to force a bridge crossing across the Rappahannock River. They take many casualties in doing this, but they ultimately are successful in forcing their way across the river and are going to occupy and hold Fredericksburg itself and allow these bridges to be built, which are going to get more and more forces across. Letterman and the medical department are going to order their medical personnel forward along with the Army to establish forward aid stations and field hospitals in the town of Fredericksburg itself. What those surgeons, stewards, and nurses find is a shattered by artillery fire and a looted city. This is a little bit of an idea of what Fredericksburg looks like in December 11th and December 12th of 1862. Shell fire had severely damaged the city, and as an attack loomed on Confederate forces just outside the city, these buildings are going to become the hospitals, the forward aid stations and hospitals that are going to be used by the Union Army over the course of this battle. This is going to become an issue for Union forces, is that these forward hospitals are going to be under Confederate guns and are going to be just a few days later on December 13th, 1862, when the main attack is going to begin at Fredericksburg by the Union Army. Confederate guns have the range of many of these hospitals and buildings in Fredericksburg, and fire is going to be continually raining in on medical personnel. So as this is another photograph kind of example of what the city looks like as after all of the shell fire is going on. Originally from Union bombardment on December 11th, and then these buildings are going to come under fire again on December 13th when Union forces. These are going to be the buildings that are going to need to be turned into makeshift military hospitals. It's going to be pretty problematic. So on the morning of December 13th, 1862, the Union assault is going to begin, and it begins actually south of Fredericksburg along the railroad tracks of the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. From this part of the battlefield, we have an interesting account of how Civil War surgeons understood the battlefield realities, but despite oftentimes being miles away from the battlefield itself in the field hospitals. Field hospitals are located, when best located, are going to be a mile or two from the battlefield, out of range of the guns. But this means that those surgeons aren't necessarily going to be knowing exactly what's going to happen on the battlefield, but they are going to be able to tell based on the wounds that they are seeing from their patients. So this is an account from Surgeon John T. Hurd of the U.S. Army. This is what he writes on this part of the battlefield. He says, quote, "For several hours, the wounds were occasioned almost entirely by shell. Shortly after noon, the 3rd Division charged the enemy in the woods and on the heights opposite of the Bernard House, running completely over 2 or 3 rebel regiments with arms stacked. Not being supported, however, our men were obliged to fall back. From this time, the character of the wounds of those conveyed to the hospital changed, wounds from rifle balls being now the most prevalent. Apparently, the arm used by the enemy was the improved rifle with the conoidal ball, that'd be the mini ball. There were, however, a number of wounded by buck and ball, as has been the case in all of our engagements." This assault proved to be unsuccessful, although the Union Army gets closer here, as you heard from Hurd's account, that they actually do overrun some Confederate forces. They are ultimately forced to retreat. But an interesting insight there from Surgeon Hurd about how the wounds could tell the story of what was going on the battlefield. Let us move forward in time a bit and move a little bit further to the north to the most famous and most remembered, and what some would say infamous, parts of the Battle of Fredericksburg. And that's going to be the battle at Marye's Heights. This is the battlefield just outside of the city of Fredericksburg. There's a long plain, almost a mile in length, that stretched from the city's outskirts to heights just outside the city. That's where Confederate forces are going to be amassed with artillery and support. It is almost a perfect defensive position. And this is where Union forces are going to continuously, through December 13th, advancing into the jaws of death. So let's take a few moments to look at some of the personal stories from those who were wounded on this battlefield and what they experienced. So let's first step behind the stone wall, which you can actually vaguely see in this sketch from Harper's Weekly. You'll note in the distance out here, lots of smoke. This is going to be from the heights, from Confederate infantry and artillery. So let's step behind that stone wall, that infamous stone wall, which is still there at Fredericksburg today, to look at a Confederate account of a pretty famous commander in the Confederate Army who's going to fall mortally wounded in this action. That is going to be one of the highest ranking Confederate officers killed at Fredericksburg is General Thomas Cobb. He commanded Confederate infantry behind the stone wall on December 13th. As Union assaults charged toward Marye's Heights, an artillery shell smashed through one of the houses nearby and exploded, and it sprayed shrapnel in all directions. One of the fragments struck General Cobb in his right leg, a smashed bone, and snipped his femoral artery. As he recovered from the explosion and the shock of the blast, he realized his peril as he was bleeding profusely and asked for a tourniquet. And a staff officer gave him a handkerchief to tie up his wound. He was stretchered off the field while trying to encourage his men. He speaks to them as they're stretchering him off the field, tries to keep them encouraged and keep their spirits up as they're continuing to repel Union assaults. He's transported behind the lines by an ambulance to a field hospital. But it turned out a handkerchief did not make for a great tourniquet, and Cobb ultimately bled to death. The surgeons at the time understood that hemorrhage and blood loss was among the most deadly challenges that they faced, and that's why tourniquets were often standard medical instruments available to medical officers. But they were not necessarily distributed to soldiers on the front lines as they are today, and were not present oftentimes when they were needed the most. And so makeshift tourniquets by soldiers on the battlefield and officers are going to have to be made. Some of them are more effective than others. In this case, Cobb's makeshift tourniquet is not going to be enough to save his life. He does pass away as a result of his wounds. Ultimately, all of Cobb's men that are going to be fighting and many other Confederate forces arrayed on Marye's Heights are going to, despite casualties, continue to maintain an almost machine gun-like fire from behind the stone wall on the heights. So let's jump across to who they are firing at and look at where the majority of woundings are going to take place during this battle, and many of those who are going to be killed in action are going to be among those attacking Marye's Heights. One of the soldiers making an assault on the heights was a young Pennsylvania officer named Frederick Hitchcock. He served with 132nd Pennsylvania Infantry. His account is a good stand-in for many of the experiences of those who were wounded at Marye's Heights that day. As he helped lead his unit forward, he had a close call with death and vividly described his wounding as he tried to help the regiment's flag bearer as they're advancing towards Marye's Heights. This is what Hitchcock writes. It's quite an extensive account, but I think sums up what it was like to be wounded at Fredericksburg and to experience going into, again, the jaws of death at Marye's Heights. Hitchcock writes, quote, "He had one flag in his hand as I approached him." This is the flag bearer. "And he was in the act of handing it to me when a bullet crashed through his arm and wrist, splattering my face with his warm blood. I seized the staff as it fell from his shattered arm. The next instant, a bullet cut the staff away just below my hand. An instant later, I was struck on the head by the fragment of a shell and fell unconscious with the colors in my hand. How long I remained unconscious, I do not know, possibly 20 minutes or more. What were my sensations when hit? I felt a terrific blow, but without pain, and the thought flashed through my mind, this is the end. And then everything was black. I do not remember falling. It takes time to write this, but events moved then with startling rapidity. When I revived, I was alone with the dead and wounded. The line of battle had been swept away. The field about me was literally covered with the blue uniforms of our dead and wounded. The firing had very perceptibly decreased. I had worn into battle my overcoat with my sword buckled on the outside. I had been hit on the left side of my head, and that side of my body was covered with blood down to my feet, which was still flowing. My first thought was to my condition, whether mortally wounded or not. I was perceptibly weakened from loss of blood, but lying there, I could not tell how much strength I had left. I did not dare move, for that would make me a target for the guns that covered that terrible wall, the muzzles of which I could plainly see. Many of them were still spitting out their fire with a venom that made my position exceedingly uncomfortable. What should I do? What could I do? To remain there was either to bleed to death or be taken prisoner and sent to Libby, which I felt would mean for me a sure lingering death. To make a move to get off the field would draw the fire of those guns, which would surely finish me. These were the alternatives. I carefully stretched my legs to test my strength, and I made up my mind I had enough left to carry me off the field, and I resolved to take my chances in the effort. I determined that I would zigzag my course to the rear so as not to give them a line shot at me. So getting myself together, I made a supreme effort, sprang up and off in jumps, first to the right, then to the left. As I expected, they opened on me, and the bullets flew thick and fast about me. The first turn, I got a bullet through my right leg just above the ankle. Felt like a stinging cut of a whip and rather accelerated my speed. About 50 yards back was an old slab fence to my right, and I plunged headlong behind that, hoping to find shelter from those bullets. I fell directly behind several other wounded men, two of whom rolled over dead from bullets that came through the slabs and which were probably aimed at me. This flushed me again, and by the same zigzag tactics, I succeeded in getting back, where to my great joy, I found Colonel Albright with what remained of the regiment. Colonel Albright grasped me in his arms as I came over, with the exclamation, "We thought you were killed." Sergeant Major Clapp told me that he had rolled me over and satisfied that I was dead before they went back. Colonel Albright staunched the flow of blood from my wound in the head by making a strong compress of my large bandana kerchief. The other wound in my leg did not give me much trouble then. In that condition, accompanied by another wounded man, I made my way back into the city. We found it one vast hospital. Ultimately, Hitchcock's wound proved to be serious, but not fatal or seriously debilitating. Another Pennsylvanian suffered a bit of a more devastating wound. So this is going to be, I'll talk a little bit here about Private William Mccarter. I'll preface this story by saying that if you want to read more of William Mccarter's account, you can go over to our website, civilwarmed.org. We have a blog there, and there's an amazing blog post about William Mccarter's wounding and his experience in the hospital afterwards. He was an Irish immigrant and a member of the 116th Pennsylvania, part of the famed Irish Brigade, and is also involved in the assault on Marie's Heights. He is shot multiple times and left behind on the battlefield for several hours. The most serious wound in his shoulder almost required amputation. He was eventually brought off the battlefield, and this is a sketch of what that may have looked like as men are being stretchered off the battlefield. Those who are lucky enough to get away from the firing on Marie's Heights, and he is going to end up in a field hospital, likely on the opposite side of the Rappahannock River, on the safe side, away from the Confederate fire. He described what he saw as he was brought to the hospital. He said, quote, "There were many amputations then going on. Lying around were cases of ugly-looking surgical tools, including the saw and knife. In the back end of each tent, a hole was made. Through it, amputated arms or legs were thrown out upon the ground." These operations were taking place in tents. Again, this is kind of what's suggesting that he may have been brought to the opposite shore where some of those hospitals had been pre-staged by Letterman and his medical department. Mccarter is actually a lot like many people living in the 1860s in the United States who thought that there were too many amputations going on. He describes this in his account that he writes years later, talks about how frequently amputation was turned to and how he felt that it was that surgeons were turning to amputation too frequently. Now, what medical professionals from that time period would tell you, and they wrote about this extensively, is that because of the weaponry that was being used, in many cases, shattered bone in arms or legs, the only recourse and the safest recourse was to actually remove that limb. Mccarter is going to get a little taste of this because he's going to absolutely refuse to allow a surgeon to remove his shattered shoulder, shattered arm. And it's going to give him problems for weeks and months afterwards, and almost result in his death. And so Mccarter describes this incident as the surgeon's trying to come in and take off his arm. He says that the surgeon, quote, was holding in one hand a bloody knife or saw, and in the other a newly amputated leg or arm dripping with human gore. Very vivid scene, one that very likely happened in hospitals throughout the Civil War. But again, Mccarter is looking at this through the perspective of these surgeons are a bit of the stereotypical lot of Civil War surgeons that we hear from Hollywood today, that they're eager to cut off arms and legs. Again, from the medical perspective, we know that this is not necessarily the case. The amputations were safe compared to the alternatives and saved countless lives during the conflict. He did ultimately ward off that surgeon and others, and he does keep his arm. He writes this account years later. Again, if you want to read more about William Mccarter's experience, you can go over to our website, civilwarmed.org, and go to the blog. Now, I want to touch on another case here because there are more than 1,000 U.S. soldiers who are going to be killed in action at the Battle of Fredericksburg. And I want to give an account of what that was like. Obviously, those who were killed in action can't give us accounts, but there is a letter in our collection at the museum that vividly describes what was happening at Marye's Heights, especially when it comes to artillery fire. And this is an account from Major George Everett of the 9th New Hampshire Volunteer Infantry. Going to be hearing more about him in upcoming videos and stories on our social media. He describes the Battle of Fredericksburg and the 9th New Hampshire's role in it in a letter to his wife, Ellen, back home in New Hampshire. This is what he writes. He says, quote, "The first man I saw hit was a soldier who had gathered behind his regiment. That was ahead of us, and it was immediately as I arose above, out of the railroad cut, a solid shot struck him and actually split him into quarters. But enough of this. I trust I may never see the like again." Again, showing the scenes that you would have seen if you were present there at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and ultimately why artillery wounds are some of the lowest numbers of wounds that will be seen in Civil War field hospitals. Oftentimes, when these artillery rounds struck, they were fatal to those who were unlucky enough to be in their path. So, take the lens back out here. Look at the whole battlefield. This is a sketch from December 13th. In the aftermath of these repeated failed assaults at Marye's Heights, the Union Army had suffered just shy of 10,000 wounded. The dead lined Marye's Heights. As doctors in town tried to put the pieces of shattered men back together or remove destroyed limbs, their hospitals in town were being struck by artillery fire and even small arms ammunition. Some of these hospitals are that close to the front lines. As night falls over the battlefield, all windows in hospitals that were facing toward Marye's Heights had to be kept closely shut, lest any light from candles should appear and attract the fire of the enemy as surgeons are at work in the hospitals of Fredericksburg. This was not sustainable. This position that the Union Army is in, back against the river, front against a strongly held Confederate position. And ultimately, after what seems like an excessive amount of time, General Ambrose Burnside, Union commander, makes the decision to evacuate the Army of the Potomac back across the river to safety on the opposite shore of the Rappahannock River. And this requires the wounded who are in Fredericksburg, in the city itself, being treated at aid stations and hospitals, that they all need to be evacuated. And so in a single night, I realized this is a sketch from December 11th. So in this case, as I'm talking about the evacuation, they're going in the wrong direction. So flip the scene, imagine all of these guys coming back across the river, in many cases in ambulances and looking defeated, as opposed to these soldiers who are marching off into battle. Army of the Potomac is nearly broken by this assault. And now the Jonathan Letterman and the Army's medical department have the task of bringing those broken pieces and those shattered men back across the river. And this is where Letterman's ambulance corps is going to truly shine during this battle. They are going to be able to safely evacuate the remainder of the wounded from the hospitals in the war-torn city of Fredericksburg and move these medical facilities and all of the personnel back to the safer shores of the river. This is one of Letterman's finest hours with the Army of the Potomac. All of his reforms and adaptations have proven successful in treating the wounded under some of the most dire circumstances ever faced by the U.S. Army during the Civil War. Now, all of this, as all of this is taking place, and this drama on the Union side of the battlefield, on the Confederate side, we have to take a look and see what's going on over here. So I have on the right a highlight of, again, the railroad and Potomac, the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad. That's always a mouthful for me. Is going to play a crucial role in evacuating many of those 4,000 wounded Confederates from this battle. Lafayette Guild and Confederate medical officers were able to methodically remove their own wounded from the Fredericksburg battlefield and evacuate them by ambulance and rail to Richmond. Throughout the battle, Guild's going to send messages to Confederate Surgeon General Samuel Preston Moore, reporting about what's going on the battlefield medically and reporting on what he is up to, which includes kind of organizing some of these private ambulances that have come in from Richmond to make sure that the wounded are being quickly and adequately transported to the railroad, again, south of Fredericksburg for shipment. Guild also notes that it was kind of problematic in the initial offing to get buildings for field hospitals and aid stations because there were so many refugees from the city of Fredericksburg. Fredericksburg is essentially emptied of people, many of whom go south, either to Richmond or some without any other place to stay in the Fredericksburg area. And so homes, buildings are full of refugees from Fredericksburg, which is going to provide a bit of a problem when you need space to actually set up field hospitals. So Guild does note this in his reports to Samuel Preston Moore. The evening of December 14th, there is an account from Fredericksburg, from Richmond, which describes the wounded who have been placed aboard trains and shipped off to Richmond's hospital. This is what that account says. Quote, on Sunday night, December 14th, the Fredericksburg cars brought down 837 wounded officers and men who were conveyed to Seabrock's warehouse and thence were distributed to the various hospitals to which they appropriately belonged. 300 more were expected by the train last night. We learned on inquiry that the wounded are generally getting along excellently, but few amputations or operations were required. These, together with the dressing of the wounds, were performed at the receiving hospital in Richmond. The wounded men were all as cheerful as men could be under such circumstances. Up to the last night, there had been but 7 deaths in the receiving hospital since the wounded had commenced arriving. Now, Guild initially reports 2,000 wounded soldiers that were treated in the Confederate Army as a result of Fredericksburg. Later amends this in a January report to more than 4,000. Those severely wounded were sent on to Richmond for better care. Less severely wounded men stayed behind with the Army at Fredericksburg. So back to these two guys, Guild on the left, Letterman on the right. They had a lot in common despite their service on opposite sides of the Civil War. Both graduates of Jefferson Medical College, both joined the U.S. Army and began their military careers in 1849, both medical directors of their respective armies, and both efficiently conducted their jobs at Fredericksburg. And their paths are going to cross again just a few months later, after this battle takes place in May of 1863 in another Union debacle at Chancellorsville. Letterman and Guild are going to work hand in hand to ensure that Union wounded are going to be properly cared for in the wake of that particular battle. After Fredericksburg, Letterman, talk about him first, faced challenges with his Army commander. Ambrose Burnside overruled Letterman and rejected the medical director's efforts to keep the wounded of the Army of the Potomac on the banks of the Rappahannock, near to the Army. This led to a disastrous and ill-planned evacuation of the wounded to Washington that caused much suffering and ultimately embarrassment to the Army of the Potomac. The relationship between Letterman and Burnside never recovered, but thankfully for Jonathan Letterman, Burnside is going to be sacked fairly quickly after all of these incidents at Fredericksburg and ultimately what's known as the Mud March in January of 1863. Burnside goes away and Letterman gets a new boss, and that is Joseph Hooker, and they're going to begin making a lot more reforms to the Army of the Potomac in 1863. That's for another presentation. On the Confederate side, and this is where I'm going to kind of close out here, an interesting story from January 1863, about a month after the Battle of Fredericksburg, with Lafayette Guild. So the aftermath of Fredericksburg gave Guild fits. A severe outbreak of smallpox gripped Richmond, Confederate capital, and ultimately spreads back up the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad back to the Army of Northern Virginia at Fredericksburg. As wounded soldiers began to return from the hospitals in Richmond, they carried a deadly outbreak with them. On January 9th, 1863, Guild wrote to Surgeon General Moore in Richmond, and this is what he wrote, said, quote, "At present, there are about 60 cases of variola and varioloid in this army. These cases have invariably occurred among the men who have recently returned to duty from the general hospitals, particularly from Richmond. Could not a system of quarantine be adopted by which the soldiers returning to duty from general hospitals might be retained sufficiently long to ensure an immunity from the contagion? I believe our exemption from a fearful epidemic of smallpox is owing to our present mode of life, bivouacking in the open air. When we go into winter quarters, I fear the health of the troops will not remain so good." Some parallels going on there, talking about disease outbreaks, quarantines, preventing sick people from getting back into the general population, limiting the amount of time, looking at the amount of time it takes to get those men back into their units, and ultimately about the open air and the problem of going into winter encampments. Bringing everybody indoors could help smallpox spread. Ultimately, this outbreak in Richmond is going to lead to a campaign of vaccination amongst the Confederate government, people of Richmond, also within the Army of Northern Virginia in 1863. Vaccination also takes place in the Army of the Potomac as well, for fear of smallpox breaking out in that winter of 1862 to 1863. So these just wanted to share, this is an image from actually the northern side of the river, but cemeteries set up because of patients dying from disease that winter. So these two great armies, the Army of Northern Virginia, Army of the Potomac, would meet again in the spring of 1863, and their respective medical officers would ultimately face new challenges when they go into Chancellorsville, the Chancellorsville campaign, the next major campaign that these armies are going to fight. All right, so that brings an end to my formal presentation for you all today. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm now going to jump into the questions and comments. I am also going to share this link. So if you have not yet followed the National Museum of Civil War Medicine to get updates about our live videos, please go ahead and click that button now. That will allow you to know when we're going live and when we're premiering videos, which we do about once or twice a week. We're going to be doing throughout 2021 as well. Hope you've been enjoying this video today. If you are enjoying this video and our others, you can help us by going and clicking that like button. Clicking the share button also helps us as well. helps more people join into the conversation. And if you really enjoy our programs, please consider donating to the museum. We have a fundraising campaign going on right now for the end of the year. And there's a link in the comments section. You can also, I believe, see it on your screen right now. You can go, any donation helps, $5, $10, $50. We'll even take $100 or $1,000. Every little bit helps to allow us to continue doing what we're doing here at the museum in regards to digital programming. All right, so I'm going to dive into the comments section here and see what we've got. And slide down through here. Got lots of folks tuning in. That's awesome. Is the White Oak Museum still in operation? That is a good question. I am not sure what their latest is in regards to if they're still open, what their deal is. That museum has lots of incredible stories about the encampments going on in and around the Fredericksburg area in the winter of 1862 to 1863. Keep going on down here. Thank you to my colleague, John Lustria, who many of you have seen in other videos as well, who has been sending links and interacting in the comment section. Very much appreciate John and all of his work. All right. Continue going on down here. If you do have any questions, please feel free to throw them in here. If not, that's fine too. I hope you all have enjoyed the program. Again, if you do enjoy these videos, please consider becoming a member of the museum, become a donor. That allows us to continue doing what we do, but also allows you to receive perks from the museum. If you become a member, you get paperwork from the museum, you get a journal, Surgeon's Call, with new research, new updates about events, exclusive events when we can hold events again. Who knows when that will be, but hopefully in 2021, we'll be getting back to programs. All right, got a question here from Jenny, asking about what dates was Dr. Mary Edward Walker working at Fredericksburg. That's a great question. She is in the Fredericksburg area throughout the battle, and we actually have an article on our website, a blog post, that goes into her experience during the Civil War and explicitly looks at some of the Fredericksburg experiences that Dr. Walker has. So Jenny, I will suggest you take a look at our Facebook page this evening. I believe the post will go out around 5 o'clock to learn more about Dr. Walker and her experience during the war, specifically looking at Fredericksburg. Some more information there. Another one from Jenny. Any books about the medical care at Fredericksburg you would recommend? No books specifically on the medical care. I will say that online there are tremendous primary source resources available. The medical and surgical history of the war has some great Fredericksburg material. The report that I referenced from Dr. Guild about the smallpox epidemic in the Army of Northern Virginia. That is in the official records of the War of the Rebellion. And Dr. Letterman and Dr. Guild both have reports throughout the official records relating to wartime experiences of the medical departments. So you can check that out. I will say I'm a big fan of Frank O'Reilly's book. I believe it's Winter War on the Rappahannock. It's about the Battle of Fredericksburg. I did, from that book, pull some details about the Cobb situation at the Sunken Road and his medical care, the treatment that he received. So there's great medical stories in there. Just a tremendous book, though. If you want to learn more about the Battle of Fredericksburg, highly recommend Frank O'Reilly's book. Question from Helen. Was Walt Whitman there during the battle? Walt Whitman is not there during the battle. He does show up immediately afterwards, though. The reason being, Walt Whitman was living in the New York area. He learns that his brother, George, was serving with a Civil War regiment, learns that he has been wounded very little detail. He sees it in the newspaper. Very little detail about his brother's situation. So he races to Fredericksburg and arrives. And thankfully, George was barely touched, had a scratch basically. That was the nature and the extent of his wounds. But Walt Whitman's experience at Fredericksburg kind of galvanizes his impact. He wants to have an impact on the war, and so he's ultimately going to stay in Washington, and he is going to stay the rest of the war and in the years that followed in Washington. Very famously is going to spend quite a bit of time in DC's military hospitals. Kind of a misnomer. Many people believe, it's kind of cast down through the ages that he was a nurse. He's not a nurse. There were official Army nurses working in those hospital wards, and sanitary commission nurses and other nurses. Walt Whitman was not a nurse. Instead, he was a volunteer, and he came in. He didn't do nursing care. He was not required to change bandages, clean bandages. He was bringing in sweets for soldiers. He was bringing in, on one occasion, ice cream. He was reading to these soldiers. In some cases, helping to write letters for them. So in some cases, doing some of the duties of a Civil War nurse, but in other cases, he wasn't actually involved in the medical care being administered. But Fredericksburg is what galvanizes him to action and what launches his work in Civil War hospitals. Continue on down here from Marie. Do you have any record of local civilians coming back towards town or out of cellars to help with the wounded? Any civilian diaries you'd recommend? I haven't really looked at the civilian experience in my research on this particular battle. Again, I would point you towards some of the published accounts of the Battle of Fredericksburg. Again, the Frank O'Reilly book is great at having both the kind of military experiences, but also some of the experiences of the local people as well. In many cases, I'll kind of expand this out from Fredericksburg. In many cases, local civilians did play a role in medical care, whether that is helping to get water or cooking for wounded soldiers, or just the fact that their homes were being kind of taken over by military authorities and going to be used for those purposes. Sometimes even when the actual civilians are unwilling, that the military is going to come in and do that anyway. So I'm sorry, I can't really directly answer as to any civilian experiences that I've come across from the Fredericksburg area, but those resources are out there and available. Continue on down here. Walking tour of Fredericksburg on the battlefield like we did with Frederick. This is from Barbara. Yes, we would love to get down to Fredericksburg. Kind of the circumstances of this wacky pandemic world that we're living in have prevented us from doing this on the battlefield. Would have loved to have been there for the anniversary today, but we are definitely going to be heading down to the Fredericksburg area to record some videos on the battlefield, to talk about some of these stories that I mentioned today, to go to some of those hospital sites and to actually take you all there virtually. And we're very, very excited about getting back to in-person programs. And some of the ideas that we have include doing some bus tours, some caravan tours that'll go to some of these spots and work with some of the incredible public historians at places like Fredericksburg, Antietam, Gettysburg, many other places like that as well. So we look forward to doing more about the Battle of Fredericksburg in the future, and look forward to hopefully being able to do things in person again. I know that it seems like it's been forever since we've been able to do that. It's almost a year now. We're very much looking forward to getting back to in-person programming in 2021. All right, everybody. Well, this is going to bring an end to my presentation today. Again, this is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Really appreciate you all watching with me today, tuning in for this presentation. For any of you who have donated, who have become members, thank you for all of your support of the museum. We really, really appreciate it. Can't tell you how thankful we are for such amazing supporters, whether or not you've given money or just watch our streams and like and share our videos. We appreciate all of you. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. And we will see you again next week. We have more wonderful videos for you to watch here on Facebook and on YouTube. Hope you all have a great day.